and space. I was practicing the, okay. No, it's not moving it. No. I'm in the presentation mode. Oh, so frustrating. Ah, there we go. Okay.
Down.
Thank you. Down. Okay. So yeah, just so basically we actually published a paper on resolving the muddle in the middle, trying to figure out how to deal with the middle Pleistocene. And this was, and in the process, we have actually decided that, you know, what we currently have is not going to help us resolve this issue. So we offered a new species. And the basic point of our paper was to actually start the discussion, not necessarily be the end of the discussion. So I just wanted to tell you that it's important to keep to the new names. We have a new name for Middle Pleistocene, that's Chibanian, and it's an official name adopted in 2020 by International Commission on Stratigraphy. And that is what should be now, you know, what we should refer to this period as. One of the things that is very important for us to understand is how this muddle in the middle actually started. What created this muddle? So basically, if you think from the perspective of how historically we went into understanding human evolution, you're going to see that we have this, you know, long history of research in Western Europe, some research in Near East, lots of research in Africa as well. And historically, these were the important places. And among these places, there is Neanderthals that are one of the species that is really easy, relatively, to recognize in the fossil record. And they actually, we do all the comparisons that we actually do in terms of human evolution revolve around comparisons of Neanderthals to modern humans. And deeper in time, we compare chimpanzees to us, and we try to find out solutions about what could have happened. And also what we have that creates this model is that we have a very truncated record. So we have some good record in Western Europe, and then we have lots of blank spaces in between. But mostly what actually created the model in the middle is how Homo heidelbergensis was revised, reintroduced into human evolution, and how it was eventually given a meaning, and how this meaning actually was becoming progressively more and more meaningless throughout this existence. And I'll show you some of that as well. The other problem is that we know that all these paleontological species that we deal with in human evolution are mute. We really do not have any evidence of strong speciation that created biological species that actually could not intermingle, interchange genes and have fertile offspring. So we know that these are not biological species in terms of a biological species concept. So we have to come up with some other different explanations. So now I'm in a different, sorry about that. Again, I have a problem. Okay, so if you look into what actually we mean by, you know, conceptualizing species in human evolution, Clifford Jolly in 2001 said that we need at least 4 million years of total separation of groups within human lineage for them to become fully incompatible species based on the life history of humans, or how long humans live. But we also know that there are substantial differences between 4 million years ago and today, and we also can see that there are very much, there is lots of variability in human hominin species and hominin evolution. So we employed something that's a pragmatic species concept that actually uses the lineable morphological characteristics meaningful morphological characteristics in terms of cladistics, so what precedes what and what can be derived from what. And these characteristics can be used to define a species. So we also have the problem of Neanderthal bias, because Neanderthals are numerous, they're extremely well researched, they influence how we perceive human evolution because they're actually relatively easy to recognize. Why are they easy to recognize? Is because as opposed to us, who retained a lot of primitive traits, Neanderthals actually derived lots of traits, and they are very specific in their morphology. They are the ones who moved away from this generalized plan of a Homo that we find already in Middle Pleistocene or Chibani. And in modern humans, there is a number of traits that are non-derived. They're shared derived with other large-brained hominins, and very few autapomorphies. So one of the most important autapomorphies is how our head is shaped and how our head actually is architecturally structured. So this different sort of house form of our head is the most important derived trait and associated with that. So this is lots of different papers that have dealt with Homo heidelbergensis, lots of them by Blanc, by Reitmeier, by our colleagues Muniz, Caparas, and most of them also by Stringer, all of them showing very overlapping features and very overlapping understanding of Homo heidelbergensis. This came to the point where when I talked to my Paleolithic archaeologist colleagues, and they say, oh, but now it's a Homo heidelbergensis. And so how is this different from being, what is Homo heidelbergensis? What is Homo heidelbergensis sensulatum? Even the specialists in the field who are not directly paleoanthropologists get completely confused, but what does it mean actually to be a Homo heidelbergensis? So you can look into, Howell in 1960 proposed that we reintroduce Homo heidelbergensis as a distinguished from Asian and African representatives of Homo erectus. And then it was really largely reintroduced by Stringer in the context of out of Africa without admixture thesis. We know now that this without admixture is actually wrong, and therefore this is the whole problem of reintroduction of Homo heidelbergensis becomes serious. Rosas and Bermudez de Castro, they consider this as a Middle Pleistocene chronospecies of Neanderthals. And this is actually where we stand right now. So you can see this was actually introduced in 1998, but I think this is what we actually think that the Homo heidelbergensis is now. In 2009, all European fossils that show any of the Neanderthal traits should be Homo neanderthalensis. Only those that do not show any Neanderthal traits should be Homo heidelbergensis. However, lots of the Heidelbergs that were introduced in this hippodyme were still have a number of Neanderthal traits. So it just shows that this species is not really well understood, well defined, and it doesn't have, and this is because it does not have a morphological basis. Homo heidelbergensis is based on a mandible. Mandible is very extremely variable, and while teeth are not, we do not have enough traits on the teeth to actually be sure about this. So here you have two different scenarios proposed by Laura Buck and Chris Stringer. One of them is that Homo erectus gave rise, oopsies, okay, I have to, okay. So Homo erectus gave rise at some point to Homo ancestor. This is a European species. And then Homo heidelbergensis developed onto one branch, giving rise to Neanderthals and Denisovans. And on the other branch, you have the Homo ancestor, possibly giving rise to Homobodoensis and then to modern humans. Now, this is a European species, this is an African species, this is an African species. So basically, from African Homo erectus, or if you understand Homo erectus sensu stricto, this is actually an Asian specimen, you would have a European specimen then deriving into African specimens. Here you have Homo erectus. Homo antecessor is a sort of a side branch. Nothing happened to it. It didn't give rise to anything. And then Homo heidelbergensis that gave rise to modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. So basically, Homo heidelbergensis would be this kind of dump-it-all Chibanian Middle Pleistocene species that gave rise to all of these, so most recent common ancestor. Neither of these scenarios is correct. Split times between Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans are not at 400 or less than 400. They're now more considered to be more towards 1 million years ago, at least between the African and Eurasian species. And therefore, this model is not correct. Now, this model is more accurate in terms of split times between African and Eurasian species, but this assumes that the Homo antecessor is at the origin of Homobodoensis, which might be a little problematic. In 2019, with my two PhD students, I looked into how these traits are distributed in the area of the world that interests me, which is Eastern Mediterranean. And we looked into we looked a little bit differently than most of the people, because when you do these comparison, you're trying to actually come up with one element that is present in a very large sample, and then you try to make sense of that sample. But what we did, we said, okay, well, we have too many variable elements. We have no information on a number of these samples. So let's just see what kind of traits does these, whatever they have, whatever material is preserved, let's not indicate the traits. Let's just figure out whether these traits are primitive, so derived from a common ancestor, inherited from a common ancestor, whether they're shared derived, something that is inherited in common ancestor, but is something present in both groups, or whether they're completely derived towards one branch or the other branch or whatever third branch we might have. And so when we looked into this on a global scale, so basically covering Europe, Eastern Mediterranean, Africa, and Asia, what you can see is that you have Neanderthals in Europe. And so basically they go from, you know, in a sort of spread from the west to the east. And you also have modern humans arising about the same time when the Neanderthals are established, firmly established in Europe. You have them arising in Africa. Otherwise, all the traits that you have, both in the Near East and in Africa, are the traits that can be either primitive, the black ones, or shared derived, which is the blue ones, which, because they are so indistinguishable and primitive and shared derived, is making these species, if they exist, very difficult to define. So we did some conference. No one was happy with the name Heidelbergensis. We figured it out, and we tried to come up with a, you know, like we're just, the group of us was trying to figure out what do we actually, how do we make sense of this period? And so basically what we have here is that in the Chibana, so this is my rendering of how our paper should look like. So it didn't make sense, didn't make it into the paper because it doesn't look like very much. But this basically shows you that there is a lot of movement, there's lots of interaction, and there is lots of the other unknowns and what happens here. And this, especially in Asia, we really still don't know very much what is happening. So there is lots of superficial resemblance between these Middle Pleistocene hominins because lots of them retain primitive traits. African and Asian faces are primitive. So is the face of modern humans. So we retain those cheekbones that are primitive, that show up in Homo erectus, that continue to show up in Middle Pleistocene, and then eventually show up in modern humans. While on the other hand, Neanderthals are developing those faces that are mid-prognathic and that are relatively easy to recognize. But one of the most important things is that we share one very strong shared-derived trait, and that is the enlarged brain. So once these hominins shared that they must have had a common ancestor which already showed tendency to an enlarged brain, or whatever the factor that is producing this enlarged brain, and then they share this trait throughout the rest of the evolution. So because some of the traits shown in Mauer mandible are Neanderthal traits, Mauer mandible as a specimen belongs to the Neanderthal lineage, and therefore there is really no need to keep Homo heidelbergensis as a taxon. So we need to get rid of Homo heidelbergensis because it's a wastebasket taxon. When you don't know what it is and it's Middle Pleistocene, you just dump it into that. So any large-brained, small-toothed hominin from Middle Pleistocene is put into Homo heidelbergensis. So it doesn't make any sense to use that term. But because, again, because some of these traits show in Mauer, the mandible under which the holotype of Homo heidelbergensis, it becomes a junior synonym for Neanderthals, and therefore it's superfluous. But we still, okay, we know that in Middle Pleistocene, or sometimes at the beginning of Middle Pleistocene, we have this common ancestor of all three African, and Eurasian lineages. So these lineages are all characterized by large brain. And some have derived faces, some have primitive faces, some have derived backs, some have primitive backs. So how do we talk about this process and about their interaction between these different groups if we do not name them, if we don't give them some kind of taxonomic identity? And because Neanderthals have been considered to be Homo neanderthalensis, then all of the others will have to have their own taxon. So if we ditch the heidelbergensis, now what do we have? Now, how do we talk about these different groups and how these different groupings make them into those pragmatic species? So we decided that it's really important to have a name for the African species that split from Eurasian species. So the first split was between African and Eurasian species. So we want to make sure that we actually have the name for that species that will eventually give rise to Homo sapiens, because we know Homo sapiens originated in Africa, and we know that it probably happened around 350,000 years ago, that we might have genetic evidence for the actual origin of Homo sapiens, or the lineages that exist today. And we could use Homo rhodesiensis. So Homo rhodesiensis is based on the one of the specimen, Kabwe cranium, from what was then Rhodesia. And the problem with this with this name is that, again, it has a very complex history of usage. And so, first of all, it really never took off. Not many people are using this term, and there must be good reason for that, because it's a convenient thing. The second thing, those who are using it very incredibly and consistently. And again, there is lots of different explanations of how it fits into human evolution, what fits into this group, etc., etc. And the other thing is that, of course, you know, the attempt to sort of decolonize human evolution, while calling an African origin species Rhodesiensis, after a guy who's probably one of the atrocious colonial rulers, not just probably, but decidedly so, is problematic. And my suspicion is that lots of people, like I personally didn't use Homo rhodesiensis because I was like, I can't really possibly use that term. So I suspect that many other people actually might have used that term if it was a little bit more neutral. And so we did a little bit, of course, research on how ICZN processes these applications for new names. So basically, you can propose a new name, and it gets registered in a zoobank as long as it's published in a peer-reviewed journal. And for that to be published in peer-reviewed journal, it has to holotype, a description, and a hippodime. And so we did that. So originally, we really didn't start with any idea of naming a species, but in the end, it was necessary to do so in order to be able to talk about human evolution in the Chibanian period conclusively, or at least so that we can understand each other when we talk about these things. So I just want to show you a couple more slides there. Right. So this is the skull of Bodo Dar. So this is a Bodo 1 specimen from the site of Bodo Dar in Ethiopia. And the Homobodoensis refers to that. We didn't use Cabuensis, which was an option, because it already had a name, so Rhodesiensis, so you couldn't really use the same holotype, and holotype is an important concept in taxonomy. And there lies the biggest problem in understanding taxonomy, is that taxonomy is essentially a 17th, 18th century science of naming things or categorizing things based on pre-evolutionary ideas. I mean, these people did not have evolutionary concepts. This is not meant to be for okay, sorry, I'm having a problem with this thing coming up. So we do not have any, they do not have any concept of evolution, and they do not need to name fossils. And so the rules of taxonomy are very strict. And one of the most important rules is that the holotype of any, if, for example, Kabwe, which is no longer called Rhodesian man, it's now called Kabwe, which is at the origin of name Homo rhodesiensis. If Kabwe is in the hippodime of the new species, then that name has precedence. Now, of course, we are aware of these rules, and it's not that we are, you know, like uninformed about what we were doing. It's just that we think that really we need to reconsider the revival of the old names that have become obsolete. We also need to reconsider whether we can actually base our talks and our understanding each other on the material that has been discovered in the late 19th, early 20th century, before we learned so much more about human evolution. So in my opinion, this is very dangerous and should not be done. And so this is why we are now looking into, and then we decided to name a new species. So in comparison to Homo erectus, Bodoensis differs by the increased cranial capacity, which is intermediate between Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and a suite of associated derived traits. So it has these traits that are connected with basically the increased cranial capacity. So this increased cranial capacity is also very important because it's a shared trait among most of the Middle Pleistocene or Chibanian hominins, excluding, for example, Homo naledi and island isolates of South Asia, such as Homo floresiensis, Luzonensis, etc. And this trait should be then present, at least in incipient form, in the most recent common ancestor of the three. And so it also different from Neanderthals, as it does not show any of the Neanderthal specific morphology, which is associated with mid-facial prognatism, these form of the cheekbones that is so typical of Neanderthals, and the form on bomb of the back of the skull, which is also very typical for Neanderthals. And also in terms of brow ridges, which are smoothly continuous in Neanderthal, and double arched in Neanderthal, so they look like this, you know, sort of McDonald's and kind of thing. And also differ from Homo sapiens specific features, especially in the back of the skull, where it actually warrants species designation. We have here we have come up with this sort of evolutionary scenario. You have early Homo, and then you have Homo erectus, presumably moved out of Africa and inhabited the rest of the whatever was known at the world then to humans. And then this Homo erectus gave rise to Homo erectus sensu stricto. That's another very problematic name in human taxonomy. And this persisted in different parts of Asia. Then in Europe, Homo antecessor would have actually moved into Europe, developed its own kind of features. We know it's not a predecessor of Neanderthals because of the proteomics research that that has been done on it. And then we have this most recent common ancestor of modern humans, so Africans here, and Eurasians. Now, Eurasians, you know the Neanderthals, okay? And we know about Denisovans, but we don't even have a scientific name for the Denisovans because we don't know. We know them only from genes and very little about their morphology. So there is still no consensus of which one this should be. So this split should have happened around 0.9 million years ago between the African and Eurasian species. And then in Africa, Homobodoensis would have actually developed eventually into Homo sapiens, while the split of this common ancestor of Denisovans and Neanderthals, or Eurasian common ancestor, would eventually split into Denisovans and Neanderthals around 0.5. And then what's happening is that we have Homo sapiens moving in and taking over the rest of these species, interacting with them, and also having interfertile offspring. We also suspect that Homobodoensis might have moved out of Africa into Eurasia, and I'll show you why I think that. And this is where we actually started our research, because this is, oh, sorry, this is a different slide now. Here I have a slide of different specimens of that belong to the hippodyme of Homobodoensis. So this is the possibility that, you know, we know that Homo erectus moved out of Africa and into, you know, Dmanisi here and Ubaidia here, and then eventually made its way into Europe, but also that it could have actually, very early hominins could have moved from Africa into Spain, into Orce and Grandolina, etc., and then developed into Neanderthals, moved eventually from that area into different parts of Eastern Mediterranean, and eventually found their way into Central Asia. And we also know that modern humans eventually made their way into Europe through Near East and maybe over the Black Sea. And so all of this area is a very likely area of constant movement and interaction. And I like to call this Eastern Mediterranean area, and Martino and Torres Bermudez del Castro and Denel made it into a common area of demographic expansion, because they suggest that we have sinks of population in the Western Europe. Whenever the glaciations come in, the population shrinks and loses it, and then you have to have an influx of a different population from the Near East. And so here is the specimen that actually started my whole quest for a different way of looking into, or maybe talking about these species because we have the specimen from Serbia in Mala Balanica that actually shows absolutely no Neanderthal traits, and it's in Europe. So we would expect that by that time, you know, around 500,000 to 400,000 years ago, because similarly, we have similarly dated specimens in Italy, in France, in Spain, and they all are Neanderthals. So why do we not have any Neanderthal traits on this specimen was a question. And I suggested that this is basically not a Neanderthal, it's probably something else. And so this specimen actually prompted us to look into possibility that these African, I personally think that, but we still have to actually test that, this is a very early African Homobodoensis moving into Eastern Mediterranean area, not finding it very easy to continue there. And eventually in that same site, we have replacement of this population by Neanderthals by about 300,000 years ago. And then Neanderthals are coming from the west towards the east, and they make it there. But Eastern Mediterranean area is this area where they could move from Africa into Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe into Asia, from Europe into Africa. So this is the area which is actually connected. And that's why it's morphologically so ambiguous, because in the larger area where there is lots of different populations intermingling, you're going to have attenuation of these very specific derived traits. So this is where we stand right now. This was our the raison d'etre of this, or the reason why we actually started with this process. So here's my very short thank you note for everyone and to my founders for sure. And now I can stop sharing my screen and let you okay, so here we go. I don't hear.
Hello, this is Rob. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Did you want to open up for questions now, or?
Sure, up to you.
Yeah. Okay. If anyone has a question, they want to throw it in the chat area. We will have a little Q&A session here.
I hope it wasn't too long, though. After all the trouble with that.
No, not at all. It wasn't long at all. We've gone over an hour before, so. Can we, if if they don't think of any questions right now, can we email you? And I know you're
Oh,
busy.
sure, absolutely, not at all a problem. I mean, it's just a lot to pack into one lecture, so I'm sure that there is a little bit that is, you know, here and there overwhelming. But yeah, and we're very happy to pass all these questions to Predrag because he's my PhD student and he loves discussing these things.
Okay. Well, if we don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and end it. I've actually recorded it, so I'll provide you with a link to the recording if you want to share it with anyone.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Not at all. Bye.
Bye-bye.